Rod Serling. You're listening to the 0 Hour.
Suspense.
I'm the Whistler.
Yours truly, Johnny Dollar.
Who is it?
The Fat Man.
Presents The Man Called X.
The Mysterious Traveler. Another journey into the realm of the strange and terrifying. I hope you will enjoy the trip, that it will thrill you a little and chill you a little. So settle back, get a good grip on your nerves. Where are we going? You'll find out when we get there.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Drama and Theater, brought to you by Duane Old Time Radio. Drama and Theater features some of the best programs from the golden age of radio, including Escape, The Fat Man, Suspense, The Whistler, 0 Hour, Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar, and many, many more. Before we start today's drama, if you enjoy what I'm doing, let me ask you to subscribe to my channel. Subscribing is 100% free, and you will receive notifications on new posts. Lastly, if you have a moment, write a short 1 or 2 sentence review or give a rating on your preferred podcast service. A positive review or rating would help me out a lot. And now, on to the drama. And thank you for your support, as always. And we have the 4th episode this week from Poirot's Christmas, written by Agatha Christie, that's funny, by Agatha Christie. This is the 4th episode, and it's aired on BBC Radio for December 1986.
Disc 4. Part 4. December the 25th. In the bright sun of Christmas noon, Poirot walked in the gardens of Gorston Hall. The hall itself was a large, solidly built house with no special architectural pretensions. Here, on the south side, was a broad terrace flanked with a hedge of clipped yew. Little plants grew in the interstices of the stone flags, and at intervals along the terrace there were stone sinks arranged as miniature gardens. Poirot surveyed them with benign approval. He murmured to himself, "C'est bien imaginé, ça." In the distance he caught sight of 2 figures going towards an ornamental sheet of water some 300 yards away. Pilar was easily recognizable as one of the figures, and he thought at first the other was Stephen Farr. Then he saw that the man with Pilar was Harry Lee. Harry seemed very attentive to his attractive niece. At intervals he flung his head back and laughed, then bent once more attentively towards her. "Assuredly, there is one who does not mourn," Poirot murmured to himself. A soft sound behind him made him turn. Magdalen Lee was standing there. She, too, was looking at the retreating figures of the man and the girl. She turned her head and smiled enchantingly at Poirot. She said, "It's such a glorious sunny day. One can hardly believe in all the horrors of last night, can one, Monsieur Poirot?" "It is difficult, truly, madame." Magdalen sighed. "I've never been mixed up in tragedy before. I've really only just grown up. I stayed a child too long, I think. That's not a good thing to do." Again she sighed. She said, "Pilar, now, seems so extraordinarily self-possessed. I suppose it's the Spanish blood. It's all very odd, isn't it?" "What is odd, madame?" "The way she turned up here out of the blue." Poirot said, "I have learned that Mr. Lee had been searching for her for some time. He had been in correspondence with the consulate in Madrid and with the vice-consul at Aliquara, where her mother died." "He was very secretive about it all," said Magdalen. "Alfred knew nothing about it. No more did Lydia." "Ah," said Poirot. Magdalen came a little nearer to him. He could smell the delicate perfume she used. "You know, Monsieur Poirot, there's some story connected with Jennifer's husband, Estravados. He died quite soon after the marriage, and there's some mystery about it. Alfred and Lydia know." I believe it was something rather disgraceful." "That," said Poirot, "is indeed sad." Magdalen said, "My husband feels, and I agree with him, that the family ought to have been told more about the girl's antecedents. After all, if her father was a criminal—" She paused, but Hercule Poirot said nothing. He seemed to be admiring such beauties of nature as could be seen in the winter season in the grounds of Gorston Hall. Magdalen said, "I can't help feeling that the manner of my father-in-law's death was somehow significant. It was so very un-English." Hercule Poirot turned slowly. His grave eyes met hers in innocent inquiry. "Ah," he said, "the Spanish touch, you think? Well, they are cruel, aren't they?" Magdalen spoke with an effect of childish appeal. "All those bullfights and things." Hercule Poirot said pleasantly, "You are saying that in your opinion Signorita Estravados cut her grandfather's throat?" "Oh, no, Monsieur Poirot." Magdalen was vehement. She was shocked. "I never said anything of the kind. Indeed, I didn't." "Well," said Poirot, "perhaps you did not. But I do think that she is, well, a suspicious person. The furtive way she picked up something from the floor of that room last night, for instance." A different note crept into Hercule Poirot's voice. He said sharply, "She picked up something from the floor last night?" Magdalen nodded. Her childish mouth curved spitefully. "Yes. As soon as we got into the room, she gave a quick glance round to see if anyone was looking, and then pounced on it. But the superintendent man saw her, I'm glad to say, and made her give it up." "What was it that she picked up? Do you know, madame?" "No, I wasn't near enough to see." Magdalen's voice held regret. "It was something quite small." Poirot frowned to himself. "It is interesting that," he murmured to himself. Magdalen said quickly, "Yes, I thought you ought to know about it. After all, we don't know anything about Pilar's upbringing, and what her life has been like. Alfred is always so suspicious, and dear Lydia is so casual." Then she murmured, "Perhaps I'd better go and see if I can help Lydia in any way. There may be letters to write." She left him with a smile of satisfied malice on her lips. Poirot remained lost in thought on the terrace. To him there came Superintendent Sugden. The police superintendent looked gloomy. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Poirot. Doesn't seem quite the right thing to say, Merry Christmas, does it?" "Mon cher collègue, I certainly do not observe any traces of merriment on your countenance. If you had said Merry Christmas, I should not have replied many of them." "I don't want another one like this, and that's a fact," said Sugden. "You have made progress, yes?" "I've checked up on a good many points. Aubrey's alibi is holding water all right. The commissionaire at the cinema saw him go in with the girl and saw him come out with her at the end of the performance, and seems pretty positive he didn't leave, and couldn't have left and returned during the performance. The girl swears quite definitely he was with her in the cinema all the time." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "I hardly see, then, what more there is to say." The cynical Sugden said, "Well, one never knows with girls. Lie themselves black in the face for the sake of a man." "That does credit to their hearts," said Hercule Poirot. Sugden growled, "Well, that's a foreign way of looking at it. It's defeating the ends of justice." Hercule Poirot said, "Justice is a very strange thing. Have you ever reflected on it?" Sugden stared at him. He said, "You're a queer one, Mr. Poirot." "Not at all. I follow a logical train of thought. But we will not enter into a dispute on the question. It is your belief, then, that this demoiselle from the milk shop is not speaking the truth?" Sugden shook his head. "No," he said, "it's not like that at all. As a matter of fact, I think she is telling the truth. She's a simple kind of girl, and I think if she was telling me a pack of lies, I'd spot it." Poirot said, "You have the experience, yes?" "Well, that's just it, Mr. Poirot. One does know, more or less, after a lifetime of taking down statements, when a person's lying and when they're not. No, I think the girl's evidence is genuine, and if so, Aubrey couldn't have murdered old Mr. Lee, and that brings us right back to the people in the house." He drew a deep breath. "One of them did it, Mr. Poirot. One of them did it. But which?" "You have no new data?" "Well, yes, I've had a certain amount of luck over the telephone calls. Mr. George Lee put through a call to Westringham at 2 minutes to 9. That call lasted under 6 minutes. "Aha! As you say, Moreover, no other call was put through to Westringham or anywhere else. Very interesting, said Poirot with approval. Monsieur George Lee says he has just finished telephoning when he hears the noise overhead, but actually he had finished telephoning nearly 10 minutes before that. Where was he in those 10 minutes? Mrs. George Lee says that she was telephoning, but actually she never put through a call at all. Where was she? Sugden said, I saw you talking to her, Monsieur Poirot. His voice held a question, but Poirot replied, You are in error. I? I was not talking to her. She was talking to me. Oh. Sugden seemed to be about to brush the distinction aside impatiently. Then, as its significance sank in, he said, She was talking to you, you say? Most definitely. She came out here for that purpose. Or what did she have to say? She wished to stress certain points. The un-English character of the crime. The possibly undesirable antecedents of Miss Estravados on the paternal side. The fact that Miss Estravados had furtively picked up something from the floor last night. Oh, she told you that, did she? Said Sugden with interest. Yes. What was it that the senorita picked up? Sugden sighed. I could give you 300 guesses. I'll show it to you. It's the sort of thing that solves the whole mystery in detective stories. If you can make anything out of it, I'll retire from the police force. Show it to me. Sugden took an envelope from his pocket and tilted its contents onto the palm of his hand. A faint grin showed on his face. There you are. What do you make of it? On the superintendent's broad palm lay a little triangular piece of pink rubber and a small wooden peg. His grin broadened as Poirot picked up the articles and frowned over them. Make anything of them, Mr. Poirot? This little piece of stuff might have been cut from a sponge bag. It was. It comes from a sponge bag in Mr. Lee's room. Somebody with sharp scissors just cut a small triangular piece out of it. Mr. Lee may have done it himself for all I know, but it beats me why he should do it. Aubrey can't throw any light on the matter. As for the peg, it's about the size of a cribbage peg, but they're usually made of ivory. This is just rough wood, whittled out of a bit of deal, I should say. Most remarkable, murmured Poirot. Keep them if you like, said Sugden kindly. I don't want them. Mon ami, I would not deprive you of them. Well, they don't mean anything at all to you? I must confess nothing whatever. Splendid, said Sugden with heavy sarcasm, returning them to his pocket. We are getting on. Poirot said, Mrs. George Lee, she recounts that the young lady stooped and picked these bagatelles up in a furtive manner. Should you say that that was true? Sugden considered the point. No, he said hesitatingly. I shouldn't go quite as far as that. She didn't look guilty. Nothing of the kind. But she did set about it rather, well, quickly and quietly, if you know what I mean. And she didn't know I'd seen her do it. That I'm sure of. She jumped when I rounded on her. Poirot said thoughtfully, Then there was a reason. But what conceivable reason could there have been? That little piece of rubber is quite fresh. It could not have been used for anything. It can have no meaning whatsoever. And yet, Sugden said impatiently, Well, you can worry about it if you like, Mr. Poirot. I've got other things to think about. Poirot asked, The case stands where, in your opinion? Sugden took out his notebook. Well, let's get down to facts. To begin with, there are the people who couldn't have done it. Let's get them out of the way first. They are Alfred and Harry Lee. They've got a definite alibi. Also, Mrs. Alfred Lee, since Tressilian saw her in the drawing-room only about a minute before the row started upstairs. Those three are clear. Now for the others. Here's a list. I've put it this way for clearness. He handed the book to Poirot. Poirot read as follows. At the time of the crime, George Lee was ... Mrs. George Lee was ... David Lee was playing piano in music room, confirmed by his wife. Mrs. David Lee was in music room, confirmed by husband. Miss Estravados was in her bedroom, no confirmation. Stephen Farr was in ballroom, playing gramophone, brackets, confirmed by 3 of staff who could hear the music in servants' hall. Poirot said, handing back the list, "And therefore?" "And therefore," said Sugden, "George Lee could have killed the old man, Mrs. George Lee could have killed him, Pilar Estravados could have killed him, and either Mr. or Mrs. David Lee could have killed him, but not both." "You do not then accept that alibi?" Superintendent Sugden shook his head emphatically. "Not on your life. Husband and wife devoted to each other. They may be in it together, or if one of them did it, the other is ready to swear an alibi. I look at it this way. Someone was in the music room playing the piano. It may have been David Lee. It probably was, since he was an acknowledged musician. But there's nothing to say his wife was there too, except her word and his. In the same way, it may have been Hilda who was playing the piano, while David Lee crept upstairs and killed his father. No, it's an absolutely different case from the 2 brothers in the dining room. Alfred Lee and Harry Lee don't love each other. Neither of them would perjure himself for the other's sake." "What about Stephen Farr?" "He's a possible suspect, because that gramophone alibi is a bit thin. On the other hand, it's the sort of alibi that's really sounder than a good cast-iron dyed-in-the-wool alibi, which 10 to 1 has been faked up beforehand." Poirot bowed his head thoughtfully. "I know what you mean. It is the alibi of a man who did not know that he would be called upon to provide such a thing." "Exactly. And anyway, somehow, I don't believe a stranger was mixed up in this thing." Poirot said quickly, "I agree with you. It is here a family affair. It is a poison that works in the blood. It is intimate. It is deep-seated. There is here, I think, hate and knowledge." He waved his hands. "I do not know. It is difficult." Superintendent Sugden had waited respectfully, but without being much impressed. He said, "Quite so, Mr. Poirot. But we'll get at it, never fear, with elimination and logic. We've got the possibilities now. The people with opportunity. George Lee, Magdalene Lee, David Lee, Hilda Lee, Pilar Estravados, and I'll add Stephen Farr. Now we come to motive. Who had a motive for putting old Mr. Lee out of the way? There again we can wash out certain people. Miss Estravados, for one. I gather that as the will stands now, she doesn't get anything at all. If Simeon Lee had died before her mother's share would have come down to her, unless her mother willed it otherwise. But as Jennifer Estravados predeceased Simeon Lee, that particular legacy reverts to the other members of the family. So it was definitely to Miss Estravados's interests to keep the old man alive. He'd taken a fancy to her. It's pretty certain he'd have left her a good slice of money when he made a new will. She had everything to lose and nothing to gain by his murder. You agree to that? Perfectly. There remains, of course, the possibility that she cut his throat in the heat of a quarrel, but that seems extremely unlikely to me. To begin with, they were on the best of terms, and she hadn't been here long enough to bear him a grudge about anything. It therefore seems highly unlikely that Miss Estravados has anything to do with the crime, except that you might argue that to cut a man's throat is an un-English sort of thing to do, as your friend Mrs. George put it. "Do not call her my friend," said Poirot hastily, "or I shall speak of your friend Miss Estravados, who finds you such a handsome man." He had the pleasure of seeing the superintendent's official poise upset again. The police officer turned crimson. Poirot looked at him with malicious amusement. He said, and there was a wistful tone in his voice, "It is true that your moustache is superb. Tell me, do you use for it a special pomade?" "Pomade? Good Lord, no." "What do you use?" "Use? Well, nothing at all. It just grows." Poirot sighed. "You are favoured by nature." He caressed his own luxuriant black moustache, then sighed. "However expensive the preparation," he murmured, "to restore the natural colour does somewhat impoverish the quality of the hair." Superintendent Sugden, uninterested in hairdressing problems, was continuing in a stolid manner. "Considering the motive for the crime, I should say that we can probably wash out Mr. Stephen Farr. It's just possible that there was some hanky-panky between his father and Mr. Lee, and the former suffered, but I doubt it. Farr's manner was too easy and assured when he mentioned that subject. He was quite confident, and I don't think he was acting. No, I don't think we'll find anything there." "I do not think you will," said Poirot. "And there's one other person with a motive for keeping old Mr. Lee alive. His son Harry. It's true that he benefits under the will, but I don't believe he was aware of the fact. Certainly couldn't have been sure of it. The general impression seemed to be that Harry had been definitely cut out of his share of the inheritance at the time he cut loose. But now he was on the point of coming back into favour. It was all to his advantage that his father should make a new will. He wouldn't be such a fool as to kill him now. Actually, as we know, he couldn't have done it. You see, we're getting on. We're clearing quite a lot of people out of the way." "How true. Very soon there will be nobody left." Sugden grinned. "We're not going as fast as that. We've got George Lee and his wife, and David Lee and Mrs. David. They all benefit by the death, and George Lee, from all I can make out, is grasping about money. Moreover, his father was threatening to cut down supplies. So we've got George Lee with motive and opportunity." "Continue," said Poirot. "And we've got Mrs. George, as fond of money as a cat is fond of cream, and I'd be prepared to bet she's heavily in debt at the minute. She was jealous of the Spanish girl. She was quick to spot that the other was gaining an ascendancy over the old man. She'd heard him say that he was sending for the lawyer. So she struck quickly. You could make out a case." "Possibly." "Then there's David Lee and his wife. They inherit under the present will, but I don't believe somehow that the money motive would be particularly strong in their case." "No?" "No. David Lee seems to be a bit of a dreamer, not a mercenary type. But he's odd. As I see it, there are three possible motives for this murder. There's the diamond complication, there's the will, and there's, well, just plain hate." "Ah, you see that, do you?" Sugden said. "Well, naturally. It's been present in my mind all along. If David Lee killed his father, I don't think it was for money. And if he was the criminal, it might explain the bloodletting." Poirot looked at him appreciatively. "Yes, I wondered when you would take that into consideration. So much blood. That is what Mrs. Alfred said. It takes one back to ancient rituals, to blood sacrifice, to the anointing with the blood of the sacrifice." Sugden said, frowning. "You mean whoever did it was mad?" "Mon cher, there are all sorts of deep instincts in man of which he himself is unaware. The craving for blood, the demand for sacrifice," Sugden said doubtfully. "David Lee looks a quiet, harmless fellow." Poirot said, "You do not understand the psychology. David Lee is a man who lives in the past, a man in whom the memory of his mother is still very much alive. He kept away from his father for many years because he could not forgive his father's treatment of his mother. He came here, let us suppose, to forgive, but he may not have been able to forgive. We do know one thing, that when David Lee stood by his father's dead body, some part of him was appeased and satisfied. The mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceeding small. Retribution, payment, the wrong wiped out by expiation." Sugden gave a sudden shudder. He said, "Don't talk like that, Mr. Poirot. You give me quite a turn. It may be that it's as you say. If so, Mrs. David knows, and means to shield him all she knows how. I can imagine her doing that. On the other hand, I can't imagine her being a murderess. She's such a comfortable, commonplace sort of woman." Poirot looked at him curiously. "So, she strikes you like that?" he murmured. "Well, yes, a homely body, if you know what I mean." "Oh, I know what you mean perfectly." Sugden looked at him. "Come now, Mr. Poirot, you've got ideas about the case. Let's have them." Poirot said slowly, "I have ideas, yes, but they are rather nebulous. Let me first hear your summing up of the case." "Well, it's as I said. Three possible motives. Hate, gain, and this diamond complication. Take the facts chronologically. 3:30, family gathering. Telephone conversation to lawyer, overheard by all the family. Then the old man lets loose on his family. Tells them where they all get off. They slink out like a lot of scared rabbits." "Hilda Lee remained behind," said Poirot. "So she did, but not for long. Then about 6, Alfred has an interview with his father. Unpleasant interview. Harry is to be reinstated. Alfred isn't pleased. Alfred, of course, ought to be our principal suspect. He had by far the strongest motive, However, to get on, Harry comes along next, is in boisterous spirits, has got the old man just where he wants him. But before those two interviews, Simeon Lee has discovered the loss of the diamonds and has telephoned to me. He doesn't mention his loss to either of his two sons. Why? In my opinion, because he was quite sure neither of them had anything to do with it. Neither of them were under suspicion. I believe, as I've said all along, that the old man suspected Horbury and one other person, and I'm pretty sure of what he meant to do. Remember, he said definitely he didn't want anyone to come and sit with him that evening. Why? Because he was preparing the way for two things. First, my visit, and second, the visit of that other suspected person. He did ask someone to come and see him immediately after dinner. Now, who was that person likely to be? Might have been George Lee. Much more likely to have been his wife. And there's another person who comes back into the picture here. Pilar Estravados. He's shown her the diamonds. He told her their value. How do we know that girl isn't a thief? Remember these mysterious hints about the disgraceful behaviour of her father? Perhaps he was a professional thief and finally went to prison for it. Poirot said slowly, "And so, as you say, Pilar Estravados comes back into the picture." "Yes, as a thief. No other way. She may have lost her head when she was found out. She may have flown at her grandfather and attacked him." Poirot said slowly, "It is possible, yes." Superintendent Sugden looked at him keenly. "But that's not your idea. Come, Mr. Poirot, what is your idea?" Poirot said, "I go back always to the same thing, the character of the dead man. What manner of a man was Simeon Lee?" "Well, there isn't much mystery about that," said Sugden, staring. "Tell me, then, that is to say, tell me from the local point of view, what was known of the man?" Superintendent Sugden drew a doubtful finger along his jawbone. He looked perplexed. He said, "Well, I'm not a local man myself. I come from Reeveshire, over the border, next county. But, of course, old Mr. Lee was a well-known figure in these parts. I knew all about him by hearsay." "Yes, and the hearsay was what?" Sugden said, "Well, he was a sharp customer. There weren't many who could get the better of him. But he was generous with his money. Open-handed as they make 'em. Beats me how Mr. George Lee can be the exact opposite, and be his father's son." "Ah, but there are two distinct strains in the family. Alfred, George, and David resemble, superficially at least, their mother's side of the family. I have been looking at some portraits in the gallery this morning." "He was hot-tempered," continued Superintendent Sugden, "and of course he had a bad reputation with women. That was in his younger days. He's been an invalid for many years now, but even there he always behaved generously. If there was trouble, he always paid up handsomely, and got the girl married off as often as not. He may have been a bad lot, but he wasn't mean. He treated his wife badly, ran after other women, and neglected her. She died of a broken heart, so they say. It's a convenient term, but I believe she was really very unhappy, poor lady. She was always sickly and never went about much. There's no doubt that Mr. Lee was an odd character, had a revengeful streak in him, too. If anyone did him a nasty turn, he always paid it back, so they say, and didn't mind how long he had to wait to do it." "The mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceeding small," murmured Poirot. Superintendent Sugden said heavily, "Mills of the devil, more likely. Nothing saintly about Simeon Lee. The kind of man you might say had sold his soul to the devil, and enjoyed the bargain. And he was proud, too, proud as Lucifer." "Proud as Lucifer," said Poirot. "It is suggestive what you say there." Superintendent Sugden said, looking puzzled, "Well, you don't mean he was murdered because he was proud?" "I mean," said Poirot, "that there is such a thing as inheritance. Simeon Lee transmitted that pride to his sons." He broke off. Hilda Lee had come out of the house and was standing looking along the terrace. "I wanted to find you, Monsieur Poirot." Superintendent Sugden had excused himself and gone back into the house. Looking after him, Hilda said, "I didn't know he was with you. I thought he was with Pilar. He seems a nice man, quite considerate." Her voice was pleasant, a low, soothing cadence to it. Poirot asked, "You wanted to see me, you say?" She inclined her head. "Yes, I think you can help me." "I shall be delighted to do so, madame." She said, "You are a very intelligent man, Monsieur Poirot. I saw that last night. There are things which you will, I think, find out quite easily. I want you to understand my husband." "Yes, madame?" "I shouldn't talk like this to Superintendent Sugden. He wouldn't understand, but you will." Poirot bowed. "You honour me, madame." Hilda went calmly on. "My husband, for many years, ever since I married him, has been what I can only describe as a mental cripple." "Ah." "When one suffers some great hurt physically, it causes shock and pain, but slowly it mends. The flesh heals, the bone knits. There may be perhaps a little weakness, a slight scar, but nothing more. My husband, Monsieur Poirot, suffered a great hurt mentally, at his most susceptible age. He adored his mother, and he saw her die. He believed that his father was morally responsible for that death. From that shock he has never quite recovered. His resentment against his father never died down. It was I who persuaded David to come here this Christmas, to be reconciled to his father. I wanted it, for his sake. I wanted that mental wound to heal. I realize now that coming here was a mistake. Simeon Lee amused himself by probing into that old wound. It was a very dangerous thing to do." Poirot said, "Are you telling me, madame, that your husband killed his father?" "I am telling you, Monsieur Poirot, that he easily might have done so. And I will also tell you this, that he did not. When Simeon Lee was killed, his son was playing the Dead March. The wish to kill was in his heart. It passed out through his fingers and died in waves of sound. That is the truth." Poirot was silent for a minute or two. Then he said, "And you, madame, what is your verdict on that past drama?" "You mean the death of Simeon Lee's wife?" "Yes," Hilda said slowly. "I know enough of life to know that you can never judge any case on its outside merits. To all seeming, Simeon Lee was entirely to blame, and his wife was abominably treated. At the same time, I honestly believe that there is a kind of meekness, a predisposition to martyrdom which does arouse the worst instincts in men of a certain type. Simeon Lee would have admired, I think, spirit and force of character. He was merely irritated by patience and tears." Poirot nodded. He said, "Your husband said last night, 'My mother never complained.' Is that true?" Hilda Lee said impatiently, "Of course it isn't. She complained the whole time to David. She laid the whole burden of her unhappiness on his shoulders. He was too young, far too young, to bear all she gave him to bear." Poirot looked thoughtfully at her. She flushed under his gaze and bit her lip. He said, "I see." She said sharply, "What do you see?" He answered, "I see that you have had to be a mother to your husband, when you would have preferred to be a wife." She turned away. At that moment David Lee came out of the house and along the terrace towards them. He said, and his voice had a clear, joyful note in it, "Hilda, isn't it a glorious day? Almost like spring instead of winter." He came nearer. His head was thrown back. A lock of fair hair fell across his forehead. His blue eyes shone. He looked amazingly young and boyish. There was about him a youthful eagerness, a carefree radiance. Hercule Poirot caught his breath. David said, "Let's go down to the lake, Hilda." She smiled, put her arm through his, and they moved off together. As Poirot watched them go, he saw her turn and give him a rapid glance. He caught a momentary glimpse of swift anxiety, or was it, he wondered, fear? Slowly, Hercule Poirot walked to the other end of the terrace. He murmured to himself, "As I have always said, I am the father confessor. And since women come to confession more frequently than men, it is women who have come to me this morning. Will there, I wonder, be another very shortly?" As he turned at the end of the terrace and paced back again, he knew that his question was answered. Lydia Lee was coming towards him. Lydia said, "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot. Tressilian told me I should find you out here with Harry, but I am glad to find you alone. My husband has been speaking about you. I know he is very anxious to talk to you." "Ah, yes. Shall I go and see him now?" "Not just yet. He hardly got any sleep last night. In the end, I gave him a strong sleeping draught. He's still asleep, and I don't want to disturb him." "I quite understand. That was very wise. I could see last night that the shock had been very great." She said seriously, "You see, Monsieur Poirot, he really cared, much more than the others." "I understand." She asked, Has the superintendent any idea of who can have done this awful thing? Poirot said deliberately, We have certain ideas, madame, as to who did not do it. Lydia said almost impatiently, It's like a nightmare, so fantastic. I can't believe it's real. She added, What about Horbury? Was he really at the cinema, as he said? Yes, madame, his story has been checked. He was speaking the truth. Lydia stopped and plucked at a bit of yew. Her face went a little paler. She said, But that's awful. It only leaves the family. Exactly. Monsieur Poirot, I can't believe it. Madame, you can, and you do believe it. She seemed about to protest. Then suddenly she smiled ruefully. She said, What a hypocrite one is. He nodded. If you were to be frank with me, madame, he said, you would admit that to you it seems quite natural that one of his family should murder your father-in-law. Lydia said sharply, That's really a fantastic thing to say, Monsieur Poirot. Yes, it is. But your father-in-law was a fantastic person. Lydia said, Poor old man. I can feel sorry for him now. When he was alive, he just annoyed me unspeakably. Poirot said, So I should imagine. He bent over one of the stone sinks. They are very ingenious, these, very pleasing. I'm glad you like them. It's one of my hobbies. Do you like this Arctic one with the penguins and the ice? Charming. And this, what is this? Oh, that's the Dead Sea, or going to be. It isn't finished yet. You mustn't look at it. Now this one is supposed to be Piana in Corsica. The rocks there, you know, are quite pink and too lovely where they go down into the blue sea. This desert scene is rather fun, don't you think? She led him along. When they had reached the farther end, she glanced at her wristwatch. I must go and see if Alfred is awake. When she had gone, Poirot went slowly back again to the garden representing the Dead Sea. He looked at it with a good deal of interest. Then he scooped up a few of the pebbles and let them run through his fingers. Suddenly, his face changed. He held up the pebbles close to his face. Sapristi, he said. This is a surprise. Now, what exactly does this mean? Part 5, December the 26th. The Chief Constable and Superintendent Sugden stared at Poirot incredulously. The latter returned a stream of small pebbles carefully into a small cardboard box and pushed it across to the Chief Constable. "Oh, yes," he said, "it is the diamonds, all right." "And you found them where, did you say?" "In the garden. In one of the small gardens constructed by Madame Alfred Lee." "Mrs. Alfred?" Sugden shook his head. "Doesn't seem likely." Poirot said, "You mean, I suppose, that you do not consider it likely that Mrs. Alfred cut her father-in-law's throat?" Sugden said quickly, "Oh, we know she didn't do that. I meant it seemed unlikely she pinched these diamonds." Poirot said, "One would not easily believe her a thief, no." Sugden said, "Anybody could have hidden them there." "That is true. It was convenient that in that particular garden, the Dead Sea as it represents, there happened to be pebbles very similar in shape and appearance." Sugden said, "You mean she fixed it like that beforehand? Ready?" Colonel Johnson said warmly, "I don't believe it for a moment. Not for a moment. Why should she take the diamonds in the first place?" "Well, as to that," Sugden said slowly. Poirot nipped in quickly. "There is a possible answer to that. She took the diamonds to suggest a motive for the murder. That is to say, she knew that murder was going to be done, though she herself took no active part in it." Johnson frowned. "Well, that won't hold water for a minute. You're making her out to be an accomplice. But whose accomplice would she be likely to be? Only her husband's. But as we know that he, too, had nothing to do with the murder, the whole theory falls to the ground." Sugden stroked his jaw reflectively. "Yes," he said, "that's so. No, if Mrs. Lee took the diamonds, and it's a big if, it was just plain robbery. And it's true, she might have prepared that garden specially as a hiding place for them till the hue and cry had died down. Another possibility is that of coincidence. That garden, with its similarity of pebbles, struck the thief, whoever he or she was, as an ideal hiding place." Poirot said, "That is quite possible. I am always prepared to admit one coincidence." Superintendent Sugden shook his head dubiously. Poirot said, "What is your opinion, Superintendent?" The superintendent said cautiously, "Mrs. Lee is a very nice lady. Doesn't seem likely that she'd be mixed up in any business that was fishy. But, of course, one never knows. Colonel Johnson said testily, "Well, in any case, whatever the truth is about the diamonds, her being mixed up in the murder is out of the question. The butler saw her in the drawing-room at the actual time of the crime. You remember that, Poirot?" Poirot said, "I had not forgotten that." The chief constable turned to his subordinate. "We'd better get on. What have you to report? Anything fresh?" "Yes, sir. I've got hold of some new information. To start with, Horbury. There's a reason why he might be scared of the police." "Robbery, eh?" "No, sir. Extorting money under threats, modified blackmail. The case couldn't be proved, so he got off, but I rather fancy he's got away with a thing or two in that line. Having a guilty conscience, he probably thought we were onto something of that kind when Tressilian mentioned a police officer last night, and it made him get the wind up." The chief constable said, So much for Horbury. What else?" The superintendent coughed. Mrs. George Lee, sir. We've got a line on her before her marriage. Was living with a Commander Jones. Passed as his daughter, but she wasn't his daughter. I think from what we've been told that old Mr. Lee summed her up pretty correctly. He was smart where women were concerned, knew a bad lot when he saw one, and he was just amusing himself by taking a shot in the dark, and he got her on the raw." Colonel Johnson said thoughtfully, "Well, that gives her another possible motive, apart from the money angle. She may have thought he knew something definite, and was going to give her away to her husband. That telephone story of hers is pretty fishy. She didn't telephone." Sugden suggested, "Why not have them in together, sir, and get at that telephone business straight? See what we get." Colonel Johnson said, "Good idea." He rang the bell. Tressilian answered it. "Ask Mr. and Mrs. George Lee to come here." "Very good, sir." As the old man turned away, Poirot said, "The date on that wall calendar, has it remained like it is since the murder?" Tressilian turned back. "Which calendar, sir?" "The one on the wall over there." The three men were sitting once more in Alfred Lee's small sitting-room. The calendar in question was a large one with tear-off leaves, a bold date on each leaf. Tressilian peered across the room, then shuffled slowly across till he was a foot or two away. He said, "Excuse me, sir, it has been torn off. It's the 26th today." "Ah, pardon. Who would have been the person to tear it off?" "Mr. Lee does, sir, every morning. Mr. Alfred. He's a very methodical gentleman." "I see. Thank you." Tressilian went out. Sugden said, puzzled, "Is there anything fishy about that calendar, Mr. Poirot? Have I missed something there?" With a shrug of his shoulders, Poirot said, "The calendar is of no importance. It was just a little experiment I was making." Colonel Johnson said, "Inquest tomorrow. There'll be an adjournment, of course." Sugden said, "Yes, sir, I've seen the coroner, and it's all arranged for." George Lee came into the room, accompanied by his wife. Colonel Johnson said, "Good morning. Sit down, will you? There are a few questions I want to ask both of you. Something I'm not quite clear about." "I shall be glad to give you any assistance I can," said George, somewhat pompously. Magdalen said faintly, "Of course." The chief constable gave a slight nod to Sugden. The latter said, "About those telephone calls on the night of the crime. You put through a call to Westringham, I think you said, Mr. Lee?" George said coldly, "Yes, I did, to my agent in the constituency. I can refer you to him, and—" Superintendent Sugden held up his hand to stem the flow. Quite so, Mr. Lee. We're not disputing that point. Your call went through at 8:59 exactly." "Well, I couldn't say as to the exact time." "Ah," said Sugden, "but we can. We always check up on these things very carefully indeed. The call was put through at 8:59, and it was terminated at 9:04. Your father, Mr. Lee, was killed about 9:15. I must ask you once more for an account of your movements." "I've told you. I was telephoning." "No, Mr. Lee, you weren't." "Nonsense. You must have made a mistake. Well, I may perhaps have just finished telephoning. I think I debated making another call, was just considering whether it was worth the expense when I heard the noise upstairs." "You would hardly debate whether or not to make a telephone call for 10 minutes. George went purple. He began to splutter. "What do you mean? What the devil do you mean? Damned impudence! You doubting my word, doubting the word of a man of my position. Why should I have to account for every minute of my time? Superintendent Sugden said with a stolidness that Poirot admired, "It's usual." George turned angrily on the chief constable. "Colonel Johnson, do you countenance this unprecedented attitude?" The chief constable said crisply, "In a murder case, Mr. Lee, questions must be asked and answered." "I have answered them. I'd finished telephoning and was debating a further call." "You were in this room when the alarm was raised upstairs?" I was. Yes, I was." Johnson turned to Magdalen. "I think, Mrs. Lee," he said, "that you stated that you were telephoning when the alarm broke out, and that at that time you were alone in this room." Magdalen was flustered. She caught her breath, looked sideways at George, at Sugden, then appealingly at Colonel Johnson. She said, "Oh, really, I don't know. I don't remember what I said. I was so upset." Sugden said, "We've got it all written down, you know." She turned her batteries on him, wide appealing eyes, quivering mouth, but she met in return the rigid aloofness of a man of stern respectability who didn't approve of her type. She said uncertainly, Well, of course I telephoned. I can't be quite sure just when." She stopped. George said, "What's all this? Where did you telephone from? Not in here?" Superintendent Sugden said, "I suggest, Mrs. Lee, that you didn't telephone at all. In that case, where were you, and what were you doing?" Magdalen glanced distractedly about her and burst into tears. She sobbed, "George, don't let them bully me. You know that if anyone frightens me and thunders questions at me, I can't remember anything at all. I don't know what I was saying that night. It was all so horrible. I was so upset, and they're being so beastly to me." She jumped up and ran, sobbing, out of the room. Springing up, George Lee blustered, "What do you mean? I won't have my wife bullied and frightened out of her life. She's very sensitive. It's disgraceful. I shall have a question asked in the House about the disgraceful bullying methods of the police. It's absolutely disgraceful." He strode out of the room and banged the door. Superintendent Sugden threw his head back and laughed. He said, "We've got them going properly. Now we'll see." Johnson said, frowning, "Extraordinary business. Looks fishy. We must get a further statement out of her." Sugden said easily, "Oh, she'll be back in a minute or two. When she's decided what to say, eh, Mr. Poirot?" Poirot, who had been sitting in a dream, gave a start. "Pardon?" "I said she'll be back." "Probably. Yes. Possibly. Oh, yes." Sugden said, staring at him, "What's the matter, Mr. Poirot? Seen a ghost?" Poirot said slowly, "You know, I am not sure that I have not done just exactly that." Colonel Johnson said impatiently, "Well, Sugden, anything else?" Sugden said, "I've been trying to check up on the order in which everyone arrived on the scene of the murder. It's quite clear what must have happened. After the murder, when the victim's dying cry had given the alarm, the murderer slipped out, locked the door with pliers or something of that kind, and a moment or two later became one of the people hurrying to the scene of the crime. Unfortunately, it's not easy to check exactly whom everyone has seen, because people's memories aren't very accurate on a point like that. Tressilian says he saw Harry and Alfred Lee cross the hall from the dining room and race upstairs. That lets them out, but we don't suspect them anyway. As far as I can make out, Miss Estravados got there late, one of the last. The general idea seems to be that Farr, Mrs. George, and Mrs. David were the first. Each of those three says one of the others was just ahead of them. That's what's so difficult. You can't distinguish between a deliberate lie and a genuine haziness of recollection. Everybody ran there. That's agreed. But in what order they ran isn't so easy to get at." Poirot said slowly, "You think that important?" Sugden said, "Well, it's the time element. The time, remember, was incredibly short." Poirot said, "I agree with you that the time element is very important in this case." Sugden went on, "What makes it more difficult is that there are two staircases. There's the main one in the hall here, about equidistant from the dining room and the drawing-room doors. Then there's one the other end of the house. Stephen Farr came up by the latter. Miss Estravados came along the upper landing from that end of the house, where her room is. The others say they went up by this staircase." Poirot said, "It is a confusion, yes. The door opened, and Magdalene came quickly in. She was breathing fast, and had a bright spot of colour in each cheek. She came up to the table, and said quietly, "My husband thinks I'm lying down. I slipped out of my room quietly. Colonel Johnson," she appealed to him with wide, distressed eyes, "if I tell you the truth, you will keep quiet about it, won't you? I mean, you don't have to make everything public." Colonel Johnson said, "You mean, I take it, Mrs. Lee, something that has no connection with the crime?" "Yes, no connection at all. Just something in my private life." The Chief Constable said, "You'd better make a clean breast of it, Mrs. Lee, and leave us to judge." Magdalene said, her eyes swimming, "Yes, I will trust you. I know I can. You look so kind. You see, it's like this. There's somebody—" She stopped. "Yes, Mrs. Lee?" "I wanted to telephone to somebody last night. A man, a friend of mine, and I didn't want George to know about it. I know it was very wrong of me, but, well, it was like that. So I went to telephone after dinner, when I thought George would be safely in the dining room, but when I got there I heard him telephoning, so I waited." "Where did you wait, madame?" asked Poirot. "There's a place for coats and things behind the stairs. It's dark there. I slipped back there, where I could see George coming out from this room. But he didn't come out, and then all the noise happened, and Mr. Lee screamed, and I ran upstairs." "So your husband did not leave this room until the moment of the murder?" "No." The Chief Constable said, "And you yourself, from 9 o'clock to 9:15, were waiting in the recess behind the stairs?" "Yes, but I couldn't say so, you see. They'd want to know what I was doing there. It's been very, very awkward for me. You do see that, don't you?" Johnson said dryly, "It was certainly awkward." She smiled at him sweetly. "I'm so relieved to have told you the truth. And you won't tell my husband, will you? No, I'm sure you won't. I can trust you, all of you." She included them all in her final pleading look. Then she slipped quickly out of the room. Colonel Johnson drew a deep breath. "Well," he said, "it might be like that. It's a perfectly plausible story. On the other hand—" "It might not," finished Sugden. "That's just it. We don't know." Lydia Lee stood by the far window of the drawing-room looking out. Her figure was half hidden by the heavy window curtains. A sound in the room made her turn with a start to see Hercule Poirot standing by the door. She said, "You startled me, Monsieur Poirot." "I apologize, madame. I walk softly." She said, "I thought it was Horbury." Hercule Poirot nodded. "It is true. He steps softly, that one, like a cat, or a thief." He paused for a minute, watching her. Her face showed nothing, but she made a slight grimace of distaste as she said, "I've never cared for that man. I shall be glad to get rid of him." "I think you will be wise to do so, madame." She looked at him quickly. She said, "What do you mean? Do you know anything against him?" Poirot said, "He is a man who collects secrets and uses them to his advantage." She said sharply, "Do you think he knows anything? About the murder?" Poirot shrugged his shoulders. He said, "He has quiet feet and long ears. He may have overheard something that he is keeping to himself." Lydia said clearly, "Do you mean that he may try to blackmail one of us? It is within the bounds of possibility, but that is not what I came here to say." "What did you come here to say?" Poirot said slowly, "I have been talking with Monsieur Alfred Lee. He has made me a proposition, and I wish to discuss it with you before accepting or declining it. But I was so struck by the picture you made, the charming pattern of your jumper against the deep red of the curtains, that I paused to admire." Lydia said sharply, "Really, Monsieur Poirot, must we waste time in compliments?" "I beg your pardon, madame. So few English ladies understand la toilette. The dress you were wearing the first night I saw you, it is bold, but simple pattern. It had grace, a distinction." Lydia said impatiently, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Poirot became grave. "Just this, madame. Your husband, he wishes me to take up the investigation very seriously. He demands that I stay here, in the house, and do my utmost to get to the bottom of the matter." Lydia said sharply, "Well?" Poirot said slowly, "I should not wish to accept an invitation that was not endorsed by the lady of the house." She said coldly, "Oh, naturally, I endorse my husband's invitation." "Yes, madame, but I need more than that." "Do you really want me to come here?" "Why not?" "Let us be more frank. What I ask you is this. Do you want the truth to come out or not?" "Oh, naturally." Poirot sighed. "Must you return me these conventional replies?" Lydia said, "I am a conventional woman." Then she bit her lip, hesitated, and said, "Perhaps it is better to speak frankly. Of course I understand you. The position is not a pleasant one. My father-in-law has been brutally murdered, and unless a case can be made out against the most likely suspect, Horbury, for robbery and murder, and it seems that it cannot, then it comes to this. One of his own family killed him. To bring that person to justice will mean bringing shame and disgrace on us all. If I am to speak honestly, I must say that I do not want this to happen." Poirot said, "You are content for the murderer to escape unpunished?" "There are probably several undiscovered murderers at large in the world. That I grant you. Does one more matter, then?" Poirot said, "And what about the other members of the family? The innocent?" She stared. "What about them? Do you realize that if it turns out as you hope, no one will ever know, that the shadow will remain on all alike?" She said uncertainly, "I hadn't thought of that." Poirot said, "No one will ever know who the guilty person is." He added softly, "Unless you know already, madame." She cried out, "You have no business to say that. It's not true. Oh, if only it could be a stranger, not a member of the family." Poirot said, "It might be both." She stared at him. "What do you mean? It might be a member of the family and at the same time a stranger." "You do not see what I mean? Eh bien, it is an idea that has occurred to the mind of Hercule Poirot." He looked at her. "Well, madame, what am I to say to Mr. Lee?" Lydia raised her hands and let them fall in a sudden helpless gesture. She said, "Of course, you must accept." Pilar stood in the centre of the music-room. She stood very straight, her eyes darting from side to side like an animal who fears an attack. She said, "I want to get away from here." Stephen Farr said gently, "You're not the only one who feels like that. But they won't let us go, my dear." "You mean the police?" "Yes." Pilar said very seriously, "It is not nice to be mixed up with the police. It is a thing that should not happen to respectable people." Stephen said with a faint smile, "Meaning yourself?" Pilar said, "No, I mean Alfred and Lydia and David and George and Hilda, and yes, Magdalene too." Stephen lit a cigarette. He puffed at it for a moment or two before saying, "Why the exception?" "What is that, please?" Stephen said, "Why leave out Brother Harry?" Pilar laughed. Her teeth showed white and even. "Harry is different. I think he knows very well what it is to be mixed up with the police." "Perhaps you're right. He certainly is a little too picturesque to blend well into the domestic picture." He went on, "Do you like your English relations, Pilar?" Pilar said doubtfully, "They are kind. They are very kind. But they do not laugh much. They are not gay. My dear girl, there's just been a murder in the house." "Yes," said Pilar doubtfully. "A murder," said Stephen instructively, "is not such an everyday occurrence as your nonchalance seems to imply. In England they take their murders seriously, whatever they may do in Spain." Pilar said, "You are laughing at me." Stephen said, "You're wrong. I'm not in a laughing mood." Pilar looked at him and said, "Because you, too, wish to get away from here?" "Yes." "And the big, handsome policeman will not let you go?" "I haven't asked him. But if I did, I've no doubt he'd say no. I've got to watch my step, Pilar, and be very, very careful." "That is tiresome," said Pilar, nodding her head. "It's just a little bit more than tiresome, my dear. Then there's that lunatic foreigner prowling about. I don't suppose he's any good, but he makes me feel jumpy." Pilar was frowning. She said, "My grandfather was very, very rich, was he not?" "I should imagine so." "Where does his money go to now? To Alfred and the others?" "Depends on his will." Pilar said thoughtfully, He might have left me some money, but I am afraid perhaps he did not. Stephen said kindly, "You'll be all right. After all, you're one of the family. You belong here. They'll have to look after you." Pilar said with a sigh, "I belong here. It is very funny that. And yet it is not funny at all." "I can see you mightn't find it very humorous." Pilar sighed again. She said, "Do you think, if we put on the gramophone, we could dance?" Stephen said dubiously, "It wouldn't look any too good. This is a house of mourning. You callous Spanish baggage." Pilar said, her big eyes opening very wide, "But I do not feel sad at all, because I did not really know my grandfather, and though I like to talk to him, I do not want to cry and be unhappy because he is dead. It is very silly to pretend." Stephen said, "You're adorable." Pilar said coaxingly, "We could put some stockings and some gloves in the gramophone, and then it would not make much noise, and no one would hear." "Come along, then, temptress." She laughed happily and ran out of the room, going along towards the ballroom at the far end of the house. Then, as she reached the side passage which led to the garden door, she stopped dead. Stephen caught up with her and stopped also. Hercule Poirot had unhooked a portrait from the wall and was studying it by the light from the terrace. He looked up and saw them. "Aha!" he said. "You arrive at an opportune moment." Pilar said, "What are you doing?" She came and stood beside him. Poirot said gravely, "I am studying something very important. The face of Simeon Lee, when he was a young man." "Oh, is that my grandfather?" "Yes, mademoiselle." She stared at the painted face. She said slowly, "How different, how very different. He was so old, so shriveled up. Here he is like Harry might have been 10 years ago." Hercule Poirot nodded. "Yes, mademoiselle. Harry Lee is very much the son of his father. Now, here," he led her a little way along the gallery, "here is, madame, your grandmother. A long, gentle face, very blonde hair, mild blue eyes." Pilar said, "Like David." Stephen said, "Just a look of Alfred, too." Poirot said, "The heredity, it is very interesting. Mr. Lee and his wife were diametrically opposite types. On the whole, the children of the marriage took after the mother. See here, mademoiselle." He pointed to a picture of a girl of 19 or so, with hair like spun gold and wide, laughing blue eyes. The colouring was that of Simeon Lee's wife, but there was a spirit, a vivacity that those mild blue eyes and placid features had never known. "Oh," said Pilar. The colour came up in her face. Her hand went to her neck. She drew out a locket on a long gold chain. She pressed the catch, and it flew open. The same laughing face looked up at Poirot. "My mother," said Pilar. Poirot nodded. On the opposite side of the locket was the portrait of a man. He was young and handsome, with black hair and dark blue eyes. Poirot said, "Your father?" Pilar said, "Yes, my father. He is very beautiful, is he not?" "Yes, indeed." "Few Spaniards have blue eyes, have they, senorita?" "Sometimes in the north. Besides, my father's mother was Irish." Poirot said thoughtfully, "So, you have Spanish blood, and Irish and English, and a touch of gypsy too. Do you know what I think, mademoiselle? With that inheritance, you should make a bad enemy." Stephen said, laughing, "Remember what you said in the train, Pilar, that your way of dealing with your enemies would be to cut their throats." "Oh." He stopped, suddenly realizing the import of his words. Hercule Poirot was quick to lead the conversation away. He said, "Ah, yes. There was something, senorita, I had to ask you. Your passport. It is needed by my friend the superintendent. There are, you know, police regulations. Very stupid, very tiresome, but necessary for a foreigner in this country. And, of course, by law, you are a foreigner." Pilar's eyebrows rose. "My passport? Yes, I will get it. It is in my room." Poirot said apologetically, as he walked by her side, "I am most sorry to trouble you. I am indeed." They had reached the end of the long gallery. Here was a flight of stairs. Pilar ran up, and Poirot followed. Stephen came too. Pilar's bedroom was just at the head of the stairs. She said, as she reached the door, "I will get it for you." She went in. Poirot and Stephen Farr remained waiting outside. Stephen said remorsefully, "Damn silly of me to say a thing like that. I don't think she noticed, though, do you?" Poirot did not answer. He held his head a little on one side, as though listening. He said, "The English are extraordinarily fond of fresh air. Miss Estravados must have inherited that characteristic." Stephen said, staring, "Why?" Poirot said softly, "Because though it is today extremely cold, the black frost, as you call it, not like yesterday, so mild and sunny, Miss Estravados has just flung up her lower window sash. Amazing to love so much the fresh air." Suddenly there was an exclamation in Spanish from inside the room, and Pilar reappeared, laughingly dismayed. "Ah!" she cried, "but I am stupid and clumsy, my little case. It was on the window-sill, and I was sorting through it so quickly and very stupidly I knocked my passport out of the window. It is down on the flower-bed below. I will get it." "I'll get it," said Stephen, but Pilar had flown past him and cried back over her shoulder, "No, it was my stupidity. You go to the drawing-room with Monsieur Poirot, and I will bring it to you there." Stephen Farr seemed inclined to go after her, but Poirot's hand fell gently on his arm, and Poirot's voice said, "Let us go this way." They went along the first-floor corridor towards the other end of the house until they got to the head of the main staircase. Here Poirot said, "Let us not go down for a minute. If you will come with me to the room of the crime, there is something I want to ask you." They went along the corridor which led to Simeon Lee's room. On their left they passed an alcove which contained 2 marble statues, stalwart nymphs clasping their draperies in an agony of Victorian propriety. Stephen Farr glanced at them and murmured, "Pretty frightful by daylight. I thought there were 3 of them when I came along the other night, but thank goodness there are only 2. "They are not what is admired nowadays," admitted Poirot, "but no doubt they cost much money in their time. They look better by night, I think." "Yes. One sees only a white glimmering figure." Poirot murmured, "All cats are grey in the dark." They found Superintendent Sugden in the room. He was kneeling by the safe and examining it with a magnifying glass. He looked up as they entered. "This was opened with a key, all right," he said, "by someone who knew the combination. No sign of anything else." Poirot went up to him, drew him aside, and whispered something. The superintendent nodded and left the room. Poirot turned to Stephen Farr, who was standing staring at the armchair in which Simeon Lee always sat. His brows were drawn together, and the veins showed in his forehead. Poirot looked at him for a minute or two in silence. Then he said, "You have the memories, yes?" Stephen said slowly, 2 days ago, he sat there alive. And now?" Then, shaking off his absorption, he said, "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. You brought me here to ask me something?" "Ah, yes. You were, I think, the first person to arrive on the scene that night. Was I? I don't remember. No, I think one of the ladies was here before me." "Which lady?" "One of the wives. George's wife, or David's? I know they were both here pretty soon." "You did not hear the scream, I think you said." "I don't think I did. I can't quite remember. Somebody did cry out, but they may have been downstairs." Poirot said, "You did not hear a noise like this?" He threw back his head and suddenly gave vent to a piercing yell. It was so unexpected that Stephen started backwards and nearly fell over. He said angrily, "For the Lord's sake, do you want to scare the whole house?" "No, I didn't hear anything in the least like that. You'll have the whole place by the ears again. They'll think another murder has happened." Poirot looked crestfallen. He murmured, "True, it was foolish. We must go at once." He hurried out of the room. Lydia and Alfred were at the foot of the stairs, peering up. George came out of the library to join them, and Pilar came running, a passport held in her hand. Poirot cried, "It is nothing, nothing. Do not be alarmed. A little experiment that I make, that was all." Alfred looked annoyed, and George indignant. Poirot left Stephen to explain, and he hurriedly slipped away along the passage to the other end of the house. At the end of the passage, Superintendent Sugden came quietly out of Pilar's room and met Poirot. "Eh bien?" asked Poirot. The superintendent shook his head. "Not a sound. His eyes met Poirot's appreciatively, and he nodded. Alfred Lee said, "Then you accept, Monsieur Poirot." His hand, as it went to his mouth, shook slightly. His mild brown eyes were alight with a new and feverish expression. He stammered slightly in his speech. Lydia, standing silently by, looked at him with some anxiety. Alfred said, "You don't know, you can't imagine what it means to me. My father's murderer must be found." Poirot said, "Since you have assured me that you have reflected long and carefully, yes, I accept. But you comprehend, Mr. Lee, there can be no drawing back. I am not the dog one sets on to hunt and then recalls because you do not like the game he puts up. Of course. Everything is ready. Your bedroom is prepared. Stay as long as you like." Poirot said gravely, "It will not be long." "Eh? What's that?" "I said it will not be long. There is in this crime such a restricted circle that it cannot possibly take long to arrive at the truth. Already I think the end draws near." Alfred stared at him. "Impossible," he said. "Not at all. The facts all point more or less clearly in one direction. There is just some irrelevant matter to be cleared out of the way. When that is done, the truth will appear." Alfred said incredulously, "You mean you know?" Poirot smiled. "Oh, yes," he said. "I know." Alfred said, My father... He turned away. Poirot said briskly, "There are, Monsieur Lee, 2 requests that I have to make." Alfred said in a muffled voice, Anything. "Then, in the first place, I would like the portrait of Monsieur Lee as a young man placed in the bedroom you are good enough to allot to me." Alfred and Lydia stared at him. The former said, "My father's portrait? But why?" Poirot said with a wave of the hand, "It will, how shall I say, inspire me." Lydia said sharply, "Do you propose, Monsieur Poirot, to solve a crime by clairvoyance?" "Let us say, madame, that I intend to use not only the eyes of the body, but the eyes of the mind." She shrugged her shoulders. Poirot continued, "Next, Monsieur Lee, I should like to know of the true circumstances attending the death of your sister's husband, Juan Estravados." Lydia said, "Is that necessary? I want all the facts, madame." Alfred said, "Juan Estravados, as the result of a quarrel about a woman, killed another man in a cafe." "How did he kill him?" Alfred looked appealingly at Lydia. She said evenly, "He stabbed him. Juan Estravados was not condemned to death, as there had been provocation. He was sentenced to a term of imprisonment and died in prison." "Does his daughter know about her father?" "I think not." Alfred said, "No. Jennifer never told her." "Thank you." Lydia said, "You don't think that Pilar—" "Oh, it's absurd." Poirot said, "Now, Monsieur Lee, will you give me some facts about your brother, Monsieur Harry Lee?" "What do you want to know?" "I understand that he was considered somewhat of a disgrace to the family. Why?" Lydia said, "It is so long ago," Alfred said, the colour coming up in his face. "If you want to know, Monsieur Poirot, he stole a large sum of money by forging my father's name to a cheque. Naturally, my father didn't prosecute. Harry's always been crooked. He's been in trouble all over the world, always cabling for money to get out of a scrape. He's been in and out of jail, here, there, and everywhere." Lydia said, "You don't really know all this, Alfred." Alfred said angrily, his hands shaking, "Harry's no good. No good whatever. He never has been." Poirot said, "There is, I see, no love lost between you." Alfred said, "He victimized my father, victimized him shamefully." Lydia sighed, a quick, impatient sigh. Poirot heard it and gave her a sharp glance. She said, "If only those diamonds could be found, I'm sure the solution lies there." Poirot said, "They have been found, madame." "What?" Poirot said gently, "They were found in your little garden of the Dead Sea." Lydia cried, "In my garden? How extraordinary!" Poirot said, "Is it not, madame?"
End of Disc 4.
Thank you for listening to and showing your support for my podcast. If you would like to receive notifications of when new episodes are posted, please subscribe to my channel. Subscriptions are 100% free, and they really help me get an idea of how I'm doing. Well, hope you enjoyed, and until next time, stay safe, wish you well, and as always, peace.